I'm going to talk to you about social media. And you may say, oh no, not someone else waffling on about social media. But I am going to give you a different way of looking at social media, one that I'm pretty confident you won't have heard of before. I want to give you a historical perspective on social media. But in order to do that, we have to decide first what social media actually is. So this is my definition of it here. It's media we get, crucially, from other people. And then it's exchanged along social connections, and it creates a distributed discussion or community beyond the room, beyond the people you're physically with. So it's very different from getting, say, an impersonal voice out of a radio. So this is my definition. If you define it this way, then actually it becomes apparent. This is how it works here. So we understand you've got a group of people over here, and they all tweet each other, and then one of them in the middle is connected to this group over here, and so it ripples across. And we understand how this works today on internet-based social networks, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all the rest of it. But actually, this kind of model, this horizontal person-to-person transmission doesn't require a digital network to happen. And what I've spent the past few years doing is looking at examples of this that occur in history. Because I think social media environments have actually existed for centuries. So what do you need? What are the conditions you need for a social media environment? Well, I think you need a bunch of things. You need literacy, because if you're going to send messages to people far away, you need to be able to write and they need to be able to read. And then you also need the cost of sharing and delivering, copying and delivering that information to be relatively low. And today it's almost free because, you know, we have our smartphones and we have broadband. But it turns out that these conditions have arisen in history before, and as far as I can tell, the first time it occurred was in the late Roman Republic. So this is Terentius Neo and his wife, and he was a baker in Pompeii, and they are holding signs of their literacy. So he is holding a scroll, and she is holding a wax tablet. This was a sort of notebook if you were a Roman, and they're basically saying, look at us, we're literate. So they are very proud of their literacy, and Romans, you know, it was a relatively literate society, and Romans wrote to each other quite a lot. And as far as I can see, the first time you get a social media ecosystem is within the Roman elite, and they're all writing letters to each other, and they're passing on news, and the Roman elite was basically a bunch of intermarried families. So the political news was the same as the social news. So-and-so has fallen out with so-and-so, so-and-so is divorcing so-and-so, etc. So if we look at the letters of the statesman and orator Cicero, for example, we see this very clearly. Here's one of an excerpt from one of his letters. I sent you on March 24th a copy of Balbus's letter to me and of Caesar's letter to him. So we can see letters being passed on second and third hand here. And this seems to have been quite widespread. Letters were essentially semi-public documents. Here's another one. Cicero, in this case, has written a letter stating his views on something, and it's an open letter, so as well as sending it to the recipient, he's also given copies of it to his friends. He's been asked for it by people. They've said, I hear you've written a really good letter to so-and-so. So he's keeping all of his outgoing mail, and in fact, we have Cicero's outbox and his inbox, so we can actually see what he did. And so this is what he's doing here. He's saying, yes, I hear that my letter's been widely published. This is actually what he wanted. This is also how books were published in the Roman world. There were no printing presses, so the way you wrote a book was that you would write it, it would be on lots of scrolls, you would give it to the richest, most influential person that you knew, someone who had a lot of traffic going through their library, and then the scholars would go to the library and they'd read it and they'd go, hey, this book's really good, can I have a copy of it, please? And then this wealthy patron would have his scribes make them a copy, and then they would take it to their library, and it would ripple. And it was only when books were rippling and people were talking about them and actually asking for copies that the bookmakers would actually start to produce them. So if you were a Roman author, you really wanted your book to be as widely pirated as possible. This was a peer-to-peer system. The other thing that was distributed in a peer-to-peer manner was the Roman newspaper, and it was called the Acta Diurna. It was founded in 59 BC by Julius Caesar. And it was published every day. And do you know how many copies of it were produced every day? One, exactly. One copy. It was put up in the forum, and if you wanted to read it, you had to go and read it yourself. And if you wanted to read it somewhere other than the forum, well, it was up to the audience to do the distribution, basically. So you would send your scribe down. You'd say, go down to the forum and note down the headlines you think I might be interested in, because I want to read the news over breakfast. And your scribe would do that, and then he'd bring you back the news, and this is the device that you would read the news on, which looks quite familiar, and this is a Roman iPad. It's actually a wax tablet, but you'll notice, and the aspect ratio is basically exactly the same. The size is identical. And in fact, if we go back to that previous one, the woman here, that's basically a Roman Galaxy S4. The button's also in the middle of the long end, which is quite interesting. So this is the way that the news got around. And if you were going out of town and you wanted to be kept informed of the news, then your friends would copy out the bits of the Acta Diurna and the other bits of the letters they'd received. And so basically, you got your news from your friends. It was a social media system. Let's move forward a bit. Here's another example. This is from 1500 years later. This is Martin Luther. And Martin Luther picks a fight with the Catholic Church over the doctrine of indulgences. And this is the sale of get-out-of-purgatory-free cards, basically. And he thinks this is a silly idea, so he writes 95 theses, essentially questions he wants to debate, questions he wants the Pope to answer. These days it would be a listicle on BuzzFeed, and it would be called 95 Reasons Why the Pope Has Got It Wrong on Indulgences, or something like that. In fact, if it was on BuzzFeed, it would be called 95 Crazy Reasons Why the Pope Has Got It Wrong. But anyway, so what he actually does, though, is he writes this out longhand, and he pins it to the church door in Wittenberg to say, I want to have a debate on this, because that was how you announced a debate. And people start copying it down, and it starts to spread, and then printers get hold of it. It's in Latin. They print copies of it, it spreads to nearby towns. The printer's there, it's causing such a stir. They reprint it, it spreads to other towns. It spreads. Luther doesn't do anything himself. Some of the printers cleverly translate it into German, which means it can reach more people, because not everyone reads Latin. It spreads incredibly fast. This is a contemporary of Luther. He says it takes 2 weeks to spread throughout Germany and a month to spread throughout the whole of Europe. And this comes as a complete surprise to Luther. He says he can't believe, they're printed and circulated, his theses, far beyond my expectation. But this means a light bulb comes on, and he goes, hang on a minute. If I want to spread my views about indulgences, this is how I do it. So he writes his next pamphlet in German. He gives it to the printer in Wittenberg, where he lives. He prints 1,000 copies. They get carried to nearby towns and cities where there are more printers who print more copies, and it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. And this is how he gets his message out. And how do we know that this was effective? How can we measure this? Well, today we measure the effectiveness of a social media campaign by counting retweets and likes and reblogs and things like that. It turns out you can do this for Martin Luther as well, because you can count the number of times that his pamphlets are reprinted, the number of new editions. And if you do that and you look at Martin Luther's traffic stats, it looks like this. And if any of you have a WordPress blog, you'll be used to looking at things like this. So Martin Luther would be pretty pleased with himself. Look at this. You see that massive spike is 1523. And that's basically the red ones here are the German pamphlets, and the blue ones are the Latin pamphlets. And the lighter colour is the reprints, and the darker colour is the original new pamphlets by Luther that year. So you can see massive spike in reprinting, and each one of those reprints is another 1,000 copies. So this causes his message to spread throughout the German lands and beyond, and the result is the split in the church between Catholics and Protestants. The Reformation comes out of this. Here's another social media platform. This one's actually connected to Oxford. This is a coffee house. First coffee house in England was here in Oxford, and coffee houses were a fantastic media sharing platform. They were where pamphlets would come in, and news books, which were an ancestor of the newspaper, and people would gather and read them and discuss them, and then they'd send them by post to other coffee houses, and they would take place in this massive distributed discussion that was going on by people inside coffee houses. And what was particularly notable about coffee houses wasn't just that they had coffee, it was also that people of different social classes were invited to mix. And so you get the gentleman, the mechanic, the lord, and the scoundrel all talking to each other. So ideas are able to cross over between different groups, different social circles in a way that they couldn't before. And this went on to have some pretty far-reaching impacts. But the main thing that this does is it allows people to be exposed to new ideas and to take part in this sort of broader discussion of things that are going on. People called coffee houses penny universities because you just paid a penny for your dish of coffee and you could go and take part in this incredibly alluring and addictive media sharing environment. And there are many more examples. I mean, I've been collecting these for a while, and so this is a commonplace book. And this is a book where you wrote interesting stuff, so it's a bit like a Tumblr or a Pinterest board. You go, oh, that's interesting. It's very rarely stuff by you. This is why I say it's like Tumblr or Pinterest. 80% of stuff on Tumblr and Pinterest is reshared, and it's the same here with these commonplace books. It's mostly other people's poems, lists, aphorisms, and so on. And then you share the book with your friends, and they copy out the bit that they're interested in. And what you choose to share with them and what you choose to put in your book is a way for you to define and express yourself. There are other examples too. Poems before the French Revolution, pamphlets in the English Civil War, pamphlets before the American Revolution. I've got a whole load of examples. Anyway, the question then is, if social media is commonplace throughout history, what happened to it? Why haven't we noticed this before? And the answer is that we went from this kind of environment, where people are sharing stuff along social networks. In the 19th century, we switched to this kind of model. And this is where a small number of people are delivering a message very, very efficiently to an enormous audience, but in an impersonal way. So this starts off with the steam press and with mass circulation newspapers. and it then goes on to radio and TV and that sort of thing. And they allow a very, very small select group of people, let's call them journalists, to reach a very large number of people. Actually, they're not always journalists, because this is the most notorious example of the effectiveness with which you can propagate a message, and this is propaganda. So this is the Nazi Volksempfänger. We've heard of the Volkswagen, the people's car. This is the people's radio, but it really was the people's radio, because it was built so that it could only pick up domestic German broadcasts. You couldn't pick up foreign news on this, so you basically had to listen to Hitler droning on all the time and making his speeches. So this sort of centralized control is the absolute opposite of social media, and this is what happened in the 19th and then mostly the 20th century. So I think this gives us a new way to look at media, because now, of course, social media is back thanks to the internet. The internet makes it very, very cheap to reach a very large audience of people. You don't need a huge and expensive printing press or radio transmitter anymore. You can just go out there onto your social platform of choice, and potentially what you write or publish can reach an audience of millions. So I think this means, instead of looking at the history of media like this as a division between old and new media, and old was essentially analog, print, broadcast, and new is digital and the internet and more social, I think that's not the whole story. And we really need to think of it like this. There was this thing called really old media, and it was actually quite similar to new media. The cutoff is 1833, which is when the first penny paper is launched in New York, and that's, for me, the beginning of old media, the beginning of the centralization. So I think this means that this pre-old media period can tell us a lot today. I think this means ancient social media systems have lessons for us. So there's a whole bunch of them. Let me just do 3 of them very quickly. Here's the first one. Is social media merely a dangerous distraction and a waste of time? Now, I'm sure you've been told this, and it's a very, very common complaint, basically that we shouldn't be calling it social networking, we should be calling it social not working. This is actually a very old complaint. Here is somebody making exactly this complaint in Oxford in the 1670s. It's Anthony Wood, and he's basically saying, why are the students not doing any work anymore? It's because they're all in the coffee house. They're blooming sharing media with their friends. Turns out this also happened in Cambridge. so equal opportunities, right? So hooray, Oxbridge. So exactly the same complaint in Cambridge, basically that the students aren't working anymore because they're just in the coffee house. Here's a pamphlet that is complaining the same thing, that coffee houses are enemies to diligence in industry and the ruin of serious young men because people are just wasting time. Is this true, though? Well, look at what actually happened at the end of the 17th century. And actually, you'll see that instead of being enemies of diligence in industry, coffee houses were actually crucibles of innovation. They allowed people and ideas to mingle in new ways, and incredible things came out of that. The scientific revolution, for example. You get scientists meeting in coffee houses. The Royal Society grows out of people meeting in coffee houses here in Oxford and in London. They sometimes even do experiments and lectures in coffee houses. And my favourite example is that Isaac Newton writes Principia Mathematica, the foundation of modern science, in order to settle a coffee house argument between Wren, Hooke and Halley. So that's, blame the coffee house. Similarly, you get commercial innovation from coffee houses. So Lloyd's of London starts off as a coffee house called Lloyd's. Another coffee house around the corner called Jonathan's turns into the London Stock Exchange. So you get amazing innovation because of these collision of ideas. And I think the same is possible on social media today. And some companies are realizing this, and they're using social media internally in order to foster collaboration and innovation. Let's move on. What's the role of social media in revolutions? We've heard a lot about this, particularly after the Arab Spring. To what extent did Facebook and Twitter play a role in what happened in Tunisia and Egypt? And can we call them Twitter revolutions and all this sort of thing? Well, it turns out we can find out by asking history, and we can ask Martin Luther. He said, from the rapid spread of the theses, I gathered what the greater part of the nation thought about indulgences. In other words, the popularity of his pamphlets was a signalling mechanism, both to him and to the readers of the pamphlets, that they all felt the same way about indulgences. So this was what modern media scholars call synchronization of opinion. And it means that people who aren't quite sure if they share the same views as other people can find out that they do. Today you can do it because 80,000 people like a Facebook page that says, let's go and have a demonstration on Saturday. But in those days you could do it because when you went to the pamphlet seller, he'd say, sorry, I've sold out of the new Martin Luther. And then you'd know that other people were trying to buy it and therefore that they were interested in what he had to say. So I think that tells us that social media doesn't actually cause revolutions. There's an underlying grievance, obviously, but what they do is they allow it to, it helps them along, allows them to spread more quickly. And one way this has been put by Jared Cohen at Google is they're an accelerant. They don't start a fire, but they help it spread more quickly. And I think that's a very good way of thinking about it. Finally, is social media a fad? That's what I hope I've convinced you, I hope I've convinced you that it's actually been around for a very long time. It's not at all a fad, and in fact, if anything was a fad, it was the old media, mass media period. That was a historical anomaly, if you look at it in these terms. Now instead we've gone back to a more social model like we had before the middle of the 19th century, but this time it's supercharged by the internet. So, social media isn't a fad, it was the mass media era that was an anomaly. Social media is here to stay. And in fact, I hope I've convinced you that modern social media users, all of you I hope you're all on Twitter, are heirs to this actually centuries-long tradition. And I hope this will change the way you look at social media, that you'll realize that all of these different modern activities have these historical predecessors. And so I hope that the sum of all of this is that I've convinced you that social media doesn't just connect us to each other today, it also links us to the past. Thank you.